Hello there everyone, welcome to the channel if you're new, welcome back if you aren't, I'm EDJ, and now we are looking at last time we looked at the Battle of Alesia, now we're going to be looking at Caesar crosses the Rubicon. So this is essentially where Caesar basically, it's war now, you know, like, they almost reach a compromise, him and Pompey, but I forgot who, but like, it didn't work out, obviously. It fell out, and then now it's like, okay, well, all bets are off. And the Civil War really started in Caesar's favor, you know? Like, what I mean is that he didn't have much legions, but fortunately Pompey was separated from most of his veterans, so he marches onto Rome, essentially takes the city without a fight, you know, so symbolically a great win there, and he goes on to Spain and, you know, takes out a lot of Pompey's veterans while Pompey's in Greece building up his strength. So overall, yeah, things work out for Caesar. So I'm really looking forward to seeing more of the personal intricacies and more of the details surrounding everything that Historia Civilis will, you know, no doubt portray fantastically. So yeah, that's about it. Let's just get to it, my friends. So if you want to watch the original video without me talking, or seeing my face here in the corner, the link's down in the description down below. Without any further ado, let us get right to it. Let's watch Caesar crosses the Rubicon.
The conquest of Gaul should have been the apex of Julius Caesar's career. The experience transformed him into Rome's richest citizen and its second most accomplished general. Politically, he was more popular than ever, and an entire generation of young politicians now considered him the leader of their faction. In 3 years, he would be eligible to run for consul for the second time, and was projected to win in a landslide. It seemed that Caesar would dominate Roman politics for the rest of his life. Instead, a little over 2 years after his victory at Alesia, Caesar marched on Rome, and the Roman Senate declared him an enemy of the Republic. How could this happen? Let's answer that question. In the aftermath of Alesia, Caesar was beginning the decades-long process of transitioning Gaul from an unruly frontier to a Roman province, but there was only so much he could do as governor. For the sake of administration, Caesar had simply thrown his conquests into the province of Transalpine Gaul. Eventually, Gaul would need to be partitioned, but this would require new legislation from the Senate. Moreover, Caesar spent the last several years buying off Gallic aristocrats with promises of Roman citizenship. Failure to deliver on this would jeopardize his new conquests. However, this would also require separate legislation from the Senate. Then there was his army. To conquer Gaul, Caesar had mobilized 50,000 soldiers. Most of these men were now approaching retirement, which usually meant that they received a plot of land from the government. If Caesar could find a way to settle these people in Italy, his 50,000 veterans would become 50,000 voters. That was enough to swing elections, but that, like everything else, would require its own legislation from the Senate. To put it quite simply, the Senate had to uphold Caesar's conquests with new legislation.
Yeah, so it's all legislation, right? That's the key word he keeps reusing. And yeah, these are, you know, little issues that obviously we don't think about. Usually we kind of get to the, oh, Caesar is a conqueror, he's conquered it, and then now, you know, onto the Civil War. But then you remember just how much more it, like, intricate and you know, so much more details that are needed in real life, right? Like, yeah, you conquer, now you need to integrate them, now you need to, you know, keep them subdued, basically transition them into, you know, a province, and you gotta retire soldiers, because even Octavian was struggling a lot with that one. How am I gonna pay off these soldiers, you know, and retire them and get them their land, you know? So, you know, there's so much more interesting little, like, obstacles that one has to overcome, right? So Yeah, overall, like I said, I mentioned this a long time ago, and I forgot which video, but it's interesting because, after looking at the history of the Empire, the Senate kind of just becomes the Emperor's, like, especially by the time of Augustus and onward, the Senate just kind of becomes the Emperor's, like, basically, like, subservient little, what's the word I'm looking for? Um, I don't know, like, pet or whatever. Point is, this I said, oh, the Senate kind of becomes irrelevant by the time of the Empire, or at least probably not the right word to use. Just it's not as prestigious or as powerful as it once was, being a part of the Senate. And Augustus essentially kind of really had all the power, and the Senate was just there for the pretext of a republic, right? but but with how kind of like, not important the Senate becomes during the Empire Age, it is interesting to watch the Republic Age when it was, obviously the governmental seat of Rome, and seeing Caesar have to continually outmaneuver them, find ways to, they're an actual obstacle for Caesar to overcome. And it's like, you tend to forget, oh yeah, at one point, the Caesars really, really had to, like, contend with these guys, before Augustus showed up and essentially made the Senate his, So, yeah, it is interesting to see the Senate in this light.
Currently, that wasn't happening. In order to make it happen, Caesar would need to be elected consul for the second time. Back in Rome, the city was still recovering from a dark period in its history. A few years earlier, angry politicians had taken advantage of dysfunction in the Senate, and gangs of armed supporters had taken control of the streets. For a while, it seemed that the Republic may be taken down by an angry mob. In a moment of desperation, the Senate turned to Rome's other most popular politician, Pompey, and empowered him to restore order. Pompey was a popular politician and a skilled general, but he wasn't one of those guys with strong ideological beliefs. That's a kind way of putting it. Some of his less kind contemporaries describe him as stupid. In his new role, Pompey surrounded himself with conservatives, and we can say with some confidence that the more he did this, the more conservative he became.
So he was, to a degree, susceptible to influence. Because, yeah, I was thinking, like, he was with Caesar, in his early rise as, a reformist, and then suddenly, even I was it was a bit jarring to see now he's the champions of the conservatives, but, he was friends with Cicero, and, yeah, so that's interesting, that Pompey could be sort of swayed, I suppose, but I think he just said he didn't have any strong, concrete beliefs. And what's the saying? If you stand for nothing, you'll fall for anything, or something like that. So yeah, that kind of makes more sense as to his jump into a completely different, group.
In the year 52 BCE, Rome received a double whammy of good news. Pompey restored order to the streets, and Caesar won an unprecedented victory against the Gauls at Alesia. After so many years of uncertainty, Rome could now feel secure both at home and abroad. The city erupted into celebration. In the midst of this wave of public support, all 10 tribunes of the plebs backed a bill that would allow Caesar to stand for election in the year 49 without having to leave Gaul. The bill passed into law. Let's pause here. Why did Caesar and his allies want this? Rome had a strict rule that forbade governors and generals from entering the city. Even Pompey, who was technically the governor of the 2 Spanish provinces, was forced to take up residence just outside the city limits. But Rome had another rule, which said that all candidates for office had to stand for election in person, in the city. So what did governors who wanted to stand for election do? One rule saying that they could not enter the city, and another saying that they must. Usually, they just resigned 6 months early and entered Rome as a private citizen. But Caesar didn't want to do that. Why? Because while in office, consuls and governors were immune from legal prosecution. We should remind ourselves why.
Yeah, it's the immunity, because, I remember kings and generals going over this. Also, I'm sorry if it annoys anyone, but I keep bringing up Rome from HBO. Like, the whole point is Caesar didn't want to lose that immunity, because obviously what he did in terms of the Gallic Wars and stuff ruffled many feathers. And, some people wanted to bring him down, like, hey, he should stand trial. And Caesar was like, I don't even want to risk that, I need to be untouchable. And yeah, that makes sense.
why legal immunity was so important to Caesar. During his year as consul, Caesar illegally passed legislation after it was vetoed by his co-consul and several tribunes of the plebs. He oversaw and perhaps ordered the assault of a fellow consul. He incited a riot. He arrested a senator for political reasons. I could go on. As consul, Caesar showed no respect for the rule of law. Cato, one of the leaders of the conservative faction, went so far as to swear an oath to personally lead the prosecution of Caesar whenever his legal immunity expired. Prosecution would endanger all of Caesar's legislative accomplishments. Banishment was also a possibility. These guys weren't playing around. Were Cato and the conservative faction coming after Caesar for political reasons? Yes. Was Caesar guilty of these crimes? Also yes. Long story short, Caesar didn't want to risk battling it out in the courts. The conservative faction was well connected, and if it came down to it, he might lose. That's why, at the urging of Caesar's supporters, the tribunes of the plebs passed a law permitting Caesar to stand for election in absentia. This way, he could transition seamlessly from governor to consul, and then from consul to governor again, extending his legal immunity indefinitely. Cato and the conservatives were pretty upset by this law. They pushed back, and the Senate descended into a heated debate over the issue. Pompey, as Rome's leading citizen, decided to stay above the fray. Caesar should have been annoyed that the conservatives in the Senate were coming after him like this. As far as he was concerned, he was abiding by the letter of the law. Besides, earlier in Pompey's career, he had done the same thing, and nobody batted an eye. It's also worth reminding ourselves that Pompey was serving as consul in the year 52, even though he was legally prohibited from doing so. This fact was definitely not lost on Caesar. If the Senate was going after him, why weren't they going after Pompey?
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's kind of like the double standard, I guess, right? I don't think I used that term correctly. The point is, it's unfair, right? The whole, hey, wait a minute. What's with this bias, If Pompey could do something, why should I also, I get that. Yeah, that would be a really annoying, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Debate raged in the Senate. The conservative faction tried repealing the law allowing Caesar to stand for election, but the tribunes of the plebs vetoed every attempt at doing so. The two sides were at a stalemate.
I'm applying for tech roles and I'm struggling with resume writing. How do I ensure I'm concisely and effective?
Caesar had been elected consul in the year 59, and because of Roman law, he was not allowed to run for a second term until the election of the year 49. Immediately after his term as consul, Caesar became the governor of the Gallic provinces for a 5-year term, from 58 to 54. In the year 55, with the end of his term in sight, Caesar had the Senate extend his command for an additional 5 years. Now, with the Senate debating Caesar's future, members of the conservative faction went back and examined this law. They discovered that it was quite badly written and never actually specified when Caesar's second 5-year term would begin or end. The conservative faction took this information and ran with it. They argued that since the law didn't give any specific dates, Caesar's second term actually began the moment the legislation passed. This would mean that his term as governor would expire in March of the year 50.
Wow, loopholes. Oh man, everyone is just finding loopholes. Caesar, just everyone is abusing the system, huh? Oh dear.
Almost 2 years earlier than expected. I've said it several times, but it's key to this whole thing, so I'll say it again. Whenever Caesar's command expired, so did his legal immunity. This may seem like a tiny disagreement, but it would have massive ramifications. Obviously, Caesar vehemently disagreed with the conservative faction's interpretation of the law. He argued that even if it was poorly written, the intent was obvious, and subsequent legislation implicitly upheld its original meaning. Specifically, he pointed to the law that the tribunes of the plebs had passed in the year 52, which allowed him to retain his command in Gaul while he stood for election in the year 49. The fact that this law existed meant that everybody was in agreement that his command expired in the year 49. The conservative faction pressed on. They decided to proceed as if they had already won the debate, and introduced new legislation to name Caesar's replacement for March of the year 50. Caesar couldn't let this happen, so he flooded the city with bribes, and the bill narrowly went down in defeat. Late in the year, Pompey finally decided to weigh in on the debate. He sided with the conservative faction, which surprised nobody, and asked Caesar to voluntarily step down before the March deadline. Caesar refused, obviously, and continued to argue that he was on the right side of the law. And to an extent, he was right, even if you take the conservative faction at their word and accept that there was some ambiguity in the law. They had failed to clarify the issue with additional legislation. The question of Caesar's command dominated the elections of that year. Two candidates from
Caesar is coming across as the more reasonable one at the moment, at this telling. Yeah, he's coming across awfully reasonable, and I'm kind of like leaning into his side more. Definitely, the conservatives just seem like, yeah, they obviously have it out, and Cato famously hated Caesar. So didn't Caesar sleep with his sister or something, or stepsister? I don't know, but yeah, either way, Cato did not like it, and yeah, they're coming across as just petty, and I don't know, just for now at the moment, I kind of like, yeah, I'm going on Caesar's side. They obviously just want him out, and it feels more fueled by hatred than it does any just cause, Though not to say Caesar's innocent. Caesar's done some pretty shady stuff, so yeah, it's just at this specific argument, I'm kind of seeing Caesar's logic prevailing more,
Conservative faction were elected consul, and each agreed that Caesar should resign his command by March of the following year. At the beginning of the year 50, one of the new consuls introduced legislation that would force Caesar to step down. The other consul shocked everybody by coming out against the proposal, even though he had been elected on this very issue. We later learned that Caesar purchased this betrayal with a massive bribe.
I just love the corruption at the late Republic. Here, he's literally bribing people. I know, like, modern days, I think bribes, aren't they illegal, like, in modern politics? I don't know about Rome, but, like, yeah, you're just seeing so much shady background stuff, and I guess that's just kind of politics in a nutshell, right? But, when has it ever been fully honest, or, like, I'm joking around, but, man, he's the richest guy, didn't he just say that? So yeah, Caesar does have the money to throw around for his advantage. Oh boy, and he's putting it to good work.
With the two consuls split on what to do, there was chaos and confusion in the Senate. Finally, one of the tribunes of the plebs spoke up, saying that if the Senate was going to ask Caesar to step down, they should also ask Pompey to do the same. Pompey was in this strange position where he had been given the command of the Spanish provinces, but had left the governing to his deputies, while he remained politically active in Italy. It was highly unusual. Caesar's allies in the Senate began to argue that this made them uncomfortable, and if Caesar needed to step down, so did Pompey. This is classic whataboutism. Criticize Caesar, what about Pompey? The two situations really had nothing to do with each other, but Caesar's allies drew a false equivalence.
Yeah, this is just deflecting in a sense, right? To be fair, that is kind of, I know this, like he just said, doesn't have to do with it, but yeah, Pompey is obviously kind of being, his, like, unorthodox situation is being ignored, while Caesar's is being attacked, so, you know, it is, I guess in the argument of fairness, you could see the logic there too. Hey, what about Pompey? No one seems to have a problem with him. You know, it almost paints the issue like, it just seems like you just hate Caesar, you know? And you just have it out for him. You're ignoring other people who are, you know, doing odd things. So, yeah. Yeah, you can kind of see Caesar's arguments there.
Between the two, and accused the other side of hypocrisy. This kept the Senate busy for several months. The conservative faction introduced several bills to formally strip Caesar of power, but each one was vetoed by one of Caesar's tribunes of the plebs. The March deadline came and went. With one deadline ignored, the Senate decided to make up a second one. The conservative faction told Caesar that he had until November to step down. This date seems completely arbitrary, and nobody quite knows why they picked it. My best guess is that they were waiting for Caesar's tribunes of the plebs to leave office in December. As the months dragged on, the Caesar question continued to dominate Roman politics. Each side vetoed the other's proposals, resolving nothing. Tempers flared. That summer, the Senate sat to discuss the growing threat of Parthia in the east. For once, the two factions could agree on something, and they decided to send 2 additional legions to Syria. But even this relatively simple procedure became hijacked by politics. For the sake of fairness, the Senate decided that Pompey and Caesar should each contribute a legion to this endeavor. Both men agreed. Caesar started to make preparations, but Pompey pulled a fast one and announced that his contribution would be one of the legions that he had loaned Caesar 4 years earlier.
Wow.
Caesar had just been bamboozled into giving away 20% of his army.
Dang. Dude, Pompey, he's kind of being like, I don't know what's the word I'm looking for, but Pompey's kind of being a little rat at the moment. I mean, not rat, but, I'm sorry, I'm like using the wrong words today. But, he's being a little devious right now, isn't he? He's kind of like antagonizing Caesar. And, yeah, that's, dang, that's devious. Wow, Pompey, I see you.
Was not pleased. He visited both legions and announced that for their loyalty he was doubling their pay and giving each soldier a Gallic slave. This had its intended effect. Instead of marching east, the 2 legions marched south and set up camp just north of the Alps. The message was unmistakable. The Senate could say whatever it wanted. Caesar's legions weren't going anywhere.
Man, that back and forth though, like Caesar handled that great. And they're just kind of like poking at each other, right? Antagonizing, but yeah, it's about to go south real quick right now.
As the year progressed, frustration mounted and public opinion began to shift. Some people began to call on Pompey to take up arms and end this stalemate. It might not be a coincidence that around this time, Pompey got very sick and recused himself from public life for a while. I read one historian that said that Pompey definitely got malaria, and another that said that he was definitely faking. There's really not much evidence to support either claim. I kinda think that he was faking it to dodge questions, but that belief is based on nothing, so make up your own mind.
Yeah.
By the time Pompey returned to public life, he was filled with a new resolve. When somebody asked him what would happen if Caesar refused to step down, he answered, "What would I do if my son came at me with a stick?" If Pompey ever had any reservations about a direct confrontation with Caesar, they were long gone. In fact, from this point forward, it's safe to say that Pompey was the leader of the conservative faction. In a sense, the Caesar question had become the central ideological issue in Roman politics. Consequently, it's no longer very useful to think in the terms of a reform faction and a conservative faction. Instead,
yeah, now it's the Caesarians and the Pompeians, right?
let's call them the Caesarian faction and the Pompeian faction. By and large, Pompeians dominated the Senate, but it's worth mentioning that there was an entire generation of young, radical senators who strongly identified with Caesar. Cicero sought to play the moderate and reconcile the two sides. He argued that Caesar had undeniably won great victories for the Republic and deserved another term as consul. He also argued that it was incumbent on everybody, including Caesar, to acknowledge the supremacy of the law. Cicero proposed a middle path, where Caesar subject himself to a slap on the wrist, and then be allowed to run for consul unimpeded. Neither side was interested in what Cicero had to say. Month after month, the Senate continued to meet. Month after month, the Pompeians demanded Caesar's resignation. Month after month, the Caesarians would answer, "What about Pompey's command?" Whenever one side got close to passing a piece of legislation, the other side would veto it. Time was running out. Next year, Caesar had every intention of running for consul, and nobody knew what would happen when he did. Crucial elections were held for the upcoming year, and Pompeian candidates won big, securing both of the consulships. Mark Antony, who had served under Caesar with distinction at the Battle of Alesia, was elected tribune of the plebs, making him the highest-ranking Caesarian in Rome.
Wow.
The Senate's November deadline came and went, and for the second time, Caesar refused to step down. In December, the Senate met yet again to discuss the Caesar question. Pompey spoke first. He announced that he was prepared to make a concession. Once Caesar resigned his command, Pompey would agree to do the same. Mutual disarmament. All Caesar had to do was step down first. One of Caesar's men rose to speak. He said that the only way Caesar would even consider something like this was if Pompey was the one to step down first. The Caesarians had been demanding Pompey's resignation all year, and this precondition had never been part of the negotiations. These guys were moving the goalposts. Did the Caesarians even want an agreement, or were they trying to derail the whole thing? We don't know. Pompey saw right through this tactic, and angrily told the Caesarians that he would not leave Rome undefended, with Caesar still in the field. Pompey would step down, but only if Caesar did so first. This was the Senate, so they put the whole thing to a vote. Should Caesar resign his command? A majority said yes, but the measure was vetoed by a Caesarian tribune of the plebs. Should Pompey resign his command? A majority voted no, and even so, a Pompeian tribune vetoed it for good measure. This wasn't a great look for Caesar. He couldn't be seen to be defying the will of the Senate. A Caesarian tribune stepped forward and suggested that the two sides compromise by combining the two bills. This question was put before the Senate. Should Pompey and Caesar resign their commands simultaneously? This is one of the rare cases where we actually know the final tally of the vote. 370 voted yes, 22 voted no. Despite the Senate's antipathy towards Caesar, most believed that a compromise like this was the only peaceful way forward.
Wow.
However, most of the Pompeian leadership, including Pompey, Cato, and the two consuls, opposed the compromise. They no longer believed that the Caesarians were negotiating in good faith. If Pompey resigned on a certain date, they had no way of guaranteeing that Caesar would do the same. The whole thing could be a trick. Despite the Senate's overwhelming vote, Pompey reiterated his position that he would only step down if Caesar did so first. Now, both men appeared to be acting in defiance of the Senate. This was kind of a brilliant maneuver by the Caesarians. Before the vote could be finalized, one of the consuls rose in disgust and screamed at his fellow senators. "The enemy is on the march, and your response is to lay down arms? Enjoy being Caesar's slaves." With that, he nullified the vote by dismissing the Senate and stormed out. After being so close to an agreement, the two sides were back where they started. A few days later, it was rumored that
so close to a compromise, and it ultimately comes down to I almost do wonder if Caesar, if let's just say Pompey did agree, right? I almost wonder if Caesar would have, or would Caesar's ambition force him to just keep going? I almost kind of wonder what Caesar would have done if, let's just say, Pompey was like, all right, I'll step down, I'll agree to this. I don't know, like, if Caesar would have agreed or not. Like, I'm questioning, even I'm a bit on the fence. But, yeah, that did seem to be the best, I suppose, compromise, but at the end, no one trusting each other, and, obviously it makes kind of sense. Everyone's a bit shady, obviously, as we've seen. Caesar, Pompey, everyone's being really shady, so it's like, so many lines have been crossed already with the both of them that I could see them, not trusting each other to actually step down, so... Yeah, that was overall probably the last chance they probably ever realistically had of settling things like peacefully.
Caesar had responded to this news by marching south with 4 legions. It wasn't true, but nobody knew that at the time. The city broke into a panic. One of the consuls took matters into his own hands and showed up at Pompey's home with a crowd of supporters. The consul presented Pompey with a sword and said, "We charge you to march against Caesar and save the Republic." Pompey accepted the sword and answered, "I will, if no alternative can be found." Cicero privately confessed his fears in a letter. "The current political situation terrifies me. Almost everybody I know wants to avoid a fight and give in to Caesar's demands. Sure, his demands are shameless, but no more shameless than when he asked for a 5-year extension to his term as governor. Why fight him on this?" He closes the letter by bashing Pompey for failing to see that this conflict posed an existential threat to the Republic. Shortly after the incident with the sword, Pompey began raising troops in Italy. The Caesarians were apoplectic and attacked Pompey for illegally assembling a legion without the Senate's permission. The Pompeians in the Senate were happy to just look the other way. For the rest of the year, the Senate continued to call for Caesar's resignation, but every time legislation was introduced, Mark Antony and other tribunes of the plebs vetoed it. On January 1st, 2 new Pompeian consuls took office. In the Senate, Antony read aloud a letter from Caesar. Caesar bragged about his achievements in Gaul and his contributions to the Republic. He concluded by saying that if the Senate passed legislation ordering him to step down, he would refuse to comply unless Pompey resigned his command first. Cicero would later call this letter offensive. Caesar's threat didn't go over well in the Senate. Legislation was introduced saying that if Caesar did not resign his command by a 3rd and final deadline, he would be considered an enemy of the Republic. The bill gave Caesar approximately 7 days to step down. The Senate voted on the bill, and it was nearly unanimous. Then, Mark Antony vetoed the whole thing. The Senate erupted into chaos. Behind the scenes, key senators decided to ignore the veto and proceed as planned. If Caesar missed the deadline, they would consider it a declaration of war.
Dang, man. All these vetoes, man. I just love that one person can veto almost unanimously, like, entire, like, legislation. I don't know, I find that funny. But, dang, yeah, even this is a bit like, yeah, you technically got vetoed, but now you're going against Caesar. Like I said, the lines are so blurred right now. There's so much gray morality, so it's like, it's all over the place.
Some days later, an elite group of senators met in Pompey's home to see if they could reach some kind of informal agreement. Pompey, Cato, Cicero, and the 2 consuls for that year represented the Pompeians. Mark Antony and several tribunes of the plebs represented the Caesarians. Cicero cast himself in the role of mediator and attempted to find common ground between the 2 sides. Mark Antony and the Caesarians came with an offer. Caesar was prepared to step down from 2 of his 3 provinces and would agree to relinquish 8 of his 10 legions. His only condition was that the Pompeians allow him to serve as consul next year. Cicero would have been happy with this compromise, but the rest of the Pompeians rejected the offer. Cicero cornered Mark Antony for a minute and then came back with a new offer. What if Caesar only kept 1 legion? This was probably the best deal that the Pompeians could hope for.
Yeah, I think I mentioned this in the Kings and Generals video. Caesar seemed... You know, like I said, I know Caesar to be an ambitious man, but here he seems pretty in good faith. Like, I guess that's if you trust Caesar or not, but I think at this point, Caesar was mainly concerned about the immunity. I don't doubt that he would find other ways to probably rise through the Roman ranks, but I think at this point, again, I have nothing backing this, right? This is just me thinking, but I do think that he was being genuine here, and that he really just, as long as he could secure his immunity, he really was willing to play ball and give up his legions. Again, like, I guess this is just what I think, but I think Caesar's coming up with this pretty, on paper, sweet offer to give to them, but, you know, they obviously refuse it, and then it's just, okay, we can't compromise, but, you know, to some degree, even the Pompeians are kind of not playing ball, so it's hard to just view Caesar as the sole aggressor of all this. It's like I said, it's a bit more complicated than that, in my opinion. So, I don't know, but if genuine, I do think Caesar was being pretty, I don't know, I guess, he was making good terms, I guess you can say, here. But unfortunately, yeah, the Pompeians were just not having it. So,
Caesar in control of a province and a legion was hardly a threat to the Republic. Cicero, Pompey, and one of the consuls accepted the offer. But then, as the 2 sides were coming together, Cato and the other consul spoke up.
So close, right? Like I said, I think Caesar was mainly just concerned with the immunity here, and I think, like I said, he would have played ball with this offer, but I still do think he probably would have found other ways down the line to, I guess, you know, further his own ambitions and power. But for now, I do think he was being genuine with this. Again, I don't know if you agree with me or that or not. That's just my opinion. I have nothing really backing it up. I don't know what his intentions were, obviously, but yeah, that's what I think. And it's just like, man, we know how just brutal this becomes, right? So the fact that they almost were like, all right, we settled this diplomatically. We can you know, put it to an end, and then now suddenly, freaking Cato, Caesar's #1 hater, shows up. I mean, a lot of people hate Caesar, but I get the impression Cato really hated Caesar, and oh man, that's a shame.
That one of their preconditions to any agreement was that Caesar relinquish all of his legions.
Cato.
Antony responded.
It's 1 legion, Cato. It's literally 1 legion.
Saying that Caesar would never accept a deal like that. Negotiations broke down, and everybody went home frustrated. I cannot overstate how close they were to an agreement. They basically had it in their hands, and then Cato, that idiot, blew it up.
Yeah. Man. Literally caused that war to happen. And a lot of death. So yeah, good on you, Cato. But man, that's just so like, one last. They were right there. They were about to shake hands, and then Cato comes in between them. Dude. That sucks.
On January 7th, which we assume was the date of the Senate's third and final deadline, the Senate passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, also known as the Final Act. Uniquely, the Final Act could not be vetoed. All it needed was a simple majority in the Senate. This was basically the Roman equivalent of martial law. It temporarily suspended existing laws and empowered the consuls to do whatever was necessary to defend the Republic. Both of the consuls were Pompeians, and now they could do whatever they wanted. Both agreed to hand their authority over to Pompey. 3 days later, on January 10th, Caesar learned that the Senate had passed the Final Act. He was wintering with the 13th Legion near the Italian border. He spent the afternoon working, and that evening attended a dinner party. Nothing unusual. Then, under the cover of darkness, Caesar ordered the legion to break camp and march south at first light. While the legion was making preparations, Caesar and a few of his officers loaded into a wagon and headed for the Italian border. They stopped at the Rubicon River, which was an insignificant body of water that the Romans used to mark the border between Cisalpine Gaul and Italy. The law forbade any general from entering Italy unless they were specifically invited to do so by the Senate. Caesar had received no such invitation. He stopped at the north bank of the river and remained there for the rest of the night. In the morning, the 13th Legion caught up with him. Once the legion was in position, Caesar paused for several long moments. Finally, in Greek, he quoted a famous play, "Let the die be cast." With that, Caesar ordered the 13th Legion across the Rubicon. At that moment, Rome entered a state of civil war.
Wow. And now it begins, and we're gonna just see how everything falls apart. But man, I'm still shocked. It still gets me how close they were to avoiding all of this, right? Then again, I do feel like maybe this was almost inevitable. Even if they had agreed then and there, I just feel like maybe Caesar would have found other ways, and I still think the conservatives would still have it out for him. So maybe this civil war was always kind of the thing, but maybe that would have just delayed it, but I feel like there would always be issues, right? Whether it be personal, political, I feel like things were about to blow up, so I don't know. But man, it really makes this conflict feel like, I don't know, I kind of view it in a grayish light. Like, I'm not really on... I feel like every side has kind of done some shady things and kind of broken the rules to a degree. So, I don't know. It's hard to take a side, to be honest. But, yeah, we know how things play out, and I'm really looking forward to hearing Historia Civilis explain it. And I'm gonna jump to the next video and hear him do just that. So thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next video. Bye, everyone.